The roots of the B-17 Flying Fortress trace back to the early 1930s, a period of considerable strategic rethinking within the United States Army Air Corps. The prevailing doctrine emphasized the potential of long-range strategic bombing as a deterrent and war-winning tool, influenced by the theories of air power advocates like Billy Mitchell. The Air Corps believed that future conflicts would require aircraft capable of flying vast distances, carrying significant bomb loads, and defending themselves without fighter escort. This vision necessitated a radical shift from existing designs, which were primarily twin-engine, short-range bombers with limited payload and defensive capabilities. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal 35-26, seeking a multi-engine bomber with unprecedented range, speed, and load-bearing capacity. The proposal demanded a combat radius of 1,020 miles while carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load at a minimum speed of 200 miles per hour. It was a bold request at a time when few aircraft could meet even half of those requirements. Boeing, Douglas, and Martin responded, but it was Boeing's Model 299 that pushed the limits of contemporary aeronautical engineering. Boeing's team, led by Chief Engineer E. Gifford Emery and designer Edward C. Wells, devised a 4-engine monoplane bomber that would later define a generation of American air power. The Model 299 was revolutionary, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R1690 Hornet radial engines and constructed with an all-metal airframe. It featured a high wing configuration and a streamlined fuselage. For defense, it carried 5 .30 caliber machine guns distributed across multiple stations for maximum coverage. The combination of power, range, and firepower led a Seattle Times reporter to dub it the Flying Fortress, a name quickly adopted by Boeing. The aircraft's internal systems were equally forward-looking. It featured enclosed cockpits, electrically actuated retractable landing gear, and a sophisticated bomb release mechanism. The design aimed to allow a single aircraft or small formation to operate deep behind enemy lines without escort, relying on its own armament and altitude to survive. This philosophy would shape much of America's strategic bombing doctrine during the coming war. Despite these innovations, the project faced obstacles. Cost concerns loomed large. Boeing's Model 299 was significantly more expensive than the twin-engine alternatives. Additionally, the War Department still debated the effectiveness of long-range bombing and whether future conflicts would necessitate such expensive, complex machines. Nonetheless, Boeing proceeded with development, confident that the Model 299 would exceed expectations. The B-17's conceptualization occurred against the backdrop of shifting global tensions. Germany, Japan, and Italy were expanding militarily, and the notion that the next war might be global in scope was becoming increasingly plausible. American strategists understood that if the U.S. were to project power across oceans, it would require platforms like the B-17, capable not only of crossing the Atlantic or Pacific, but of delivering meaningful force upon arrival. As the prototype neared completion in mid-1935, the Army Air Corps grew increasingly interested. The potential to outpace and outgun any known bomber in the world presented an opportunity to leap ahead in air power capability. It was not just a new aircraft, but a signal of intent. The United States was willing to invest in air dominance, and the B-17 was to be the tip of that spear. By the summer of 1935, the stage was set for the next phase, testing the prototype and proving the concept. What began as a response to a circular proposal would soon evolve into one of the most iconic bombers of World War II and a centerpiece of Allied strategy in the European theater. But before that could happen, the Model 299 would need to fly and survive scrutiny under the harshest tests the military could devise. The Model 299 took to the skies for its maiden flight on July 28, 1935, from Boeing Field in Seattle. Piloted by Boeing's chief test pilot Les Tower, the flight was a demonstration of both ambition and engineering precision. The prototype impressed observers with its stability, speed, and sheer size. Within days, the aircraft flew to Wright Field in Ohio for formal evaluation by the U.S. Army Air Corps. Despite being an experimental prototype, the Model 299 delivered promising results from the outset. It cruised faster, climbed higher, and flew farther than any other bomber then in existence. However, the testing phase would soon highlight the risks inherent in such innovation. On October 30, 1935, tragedy struck. During a routine takeoff at Wright Field, the prototype crashed shortly after becoming airborne, killing Tower and another crew member. The investigation revealed that the control surfaces had been locked prior to takeoff, a simple oversight with devastating consequences. Though pilot error was blamed, critics questioned the aircraft's complexity. The Model 299 had many more systems than earlier bombers, and the accident raised concerns about operational safety. In response, Boeing engineers implemented one of the most influential changes in aviation history, the checklist. Recognizing that even experienced pilots could forget critical steps in pre-flight preparation, Boeing introduced a standardized series of procedural checks to be followed before every flight. This innovation would go on to revolutionize aircraft operations worldwide and remains a fundamental aspect of aviation safety to this day. Despite the crash, the performance data collected before the accident convinced many within the Air Corps of the aircraft's potential. Though the Army awarded the formal contract to the less ambitious Douglas B-17 Bolo due to procurement rules that disqualified the crashed prototype, they quietly placed a small order for 13 YB-17s, the pre-production version of the Model 299, for further evaluation. This decision allowed Boeing to remain in contention and laid the foundation for what would become the B-17 series. The YB-17s featured several modifications over the original prototype. The engines were upgraded to more powerful Wright R-1820 Cyclones, and armament was increased to 6 machine guns, reinforcing the aircraft's self-defense capabilities. Adjustments to control surfaces, armor, and fuel systems improved both safety and operational reliability. These aircraft were distributed to the 2nd Bombardment Group for extensive testing and familiarization. Early pilot feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The B-17 proved to be a forgiving aircraft to fly, with excellent visibility and stable handling characteristics. One key strength was its ability to sustain flight even after taking considerable damage. This trait, though not fully understood at the time, would later become legendary among bomber crews in Europe. In one early test, a YB-17 flew nearly 2,000 miles on 3 engines without incident. The Air Corps took notice, and the notion of an aircraft that could reach the heart of enemy territory and return even under fire began to seem not just plausible, but practical. In parallel, Boeing began refining the production version, the B-17B. This model featured an enclosed tailgunner's position and refinements to the fuselage and defensive systems. Though only 39 B-17Bs were produced, they marked the beginning of large-scale production and allowed Boeing to establish the industrial processes necessary to meet future demand. With the escalating conflict in Europe and increasing tensions in the Pacific, the timing would prove critical. By 1939, the B-17 had already begun to show signs of becoming more than just a technical experiment. It was maturing into a serious weapon of war. The Air Corps' commitment to the bomber grew steadily, as subsequent variants like the B-17C and B-17D introduced self-sealing fuel tanks and additional armament. The aircraft transitioned from prototype to frontline tool in America's growing strategic arsenal. Still, it had yet to face combat. Its real test would come not in flight trials or engineering diagrams, but over the skies of Europe, where swarms of German fighters and thick flak fields awaited. The next chapter of the B-17's story would determine whether the aircraft could deliver on its promise, not only to fly, but to fight and return. The entry of the B-17 Flying Fortress into active service coincided with a rapid transformation in the U.S. Army Air Corps' strategic doctrine. By 1940, as Europe was engulfed in war, the United States was still officially neutral, but the military was preparing for possible involvement. The B-17's long-range capabilities made it central to new plans focused on precision daylight bombing, striking strategic industrial and military targets deep inside enemy territory with minimal civilian casualties. This concept demanded a bomber that could navigate vast distances, absorb punishment, and defend itself without escort fighters. The B-17 was the embodiment of that vision. The earliest operational units to receive the aircraft were the 2nd Bomb Group and the 19th Bomb Group, based in the continental United States. Their initial missions focused on training, navigation exercises, and long-range formation flying. These early flights helped iron out operational procedures and allowed pilots and crews to become familiar with the aircraft's systems. Despite limited experience, air crews were quickly impressed by the B-17's ruggedness and stability. The aircraft could remain controllable even with severe structural damage. Pilots routinely trained to handle engine failure, hydraulic loss, or structural compromise. As tensions with Japan escalated in the Pacific, B-17s were deployed to reinforce U.S. positions in the Philippines, Hawaii, and Midway. In late 1941, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 19th Bomb Group was stationed at Clark Field in the Philippines with several B-17C and B-17D models. These aircraft lacked some of the later armor and self-sealing fuel tanks and were vulnerable to attack. On December 7, 1941, a squadron of B-17s flying into Hawaii during the Japanese assault found themselves in the middle of the war. Several were destroyed on the ground or in the air, highlighting the risks of operating heavy bombers without fighter protection. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the B-17 was rushed into service across multiple theaters. It quickly became a symbol of America's growing air power. In the early months of the war, the aircraft was deployed to North Africa, the Pacific, and most significantly, the United Kingdom. There, under the command of the newly established 8th Air Force, the B-17 would begin its central role in the Allied air campaign against Nazi Germany. Initial missions out of England in 1942 were limited in scale, usually involving small formations targeting submarine pens, rail yards, or factories in occupied France and the Low Countries. The aircraft flew from bases such as RAF Bassingbourn and RAF Molesworth, often escorted only part of the way by short-range fighters like the Spitfire. Nonetheless, these early raids helped refine bombing techniques, assess German air defenses, and improve crew coordination. American commanders believed that tight formations of B-17s, overlapping fields of defensive fire, and precise high-altitude bombing could overwhelm enemy defenses. This theory was put to the test in mid-1943 when large-scale raids began against targets deep inside Germany, including industrial cities like Bremen and Hamburg. The B-17's ability to fly at altitudes above 25,000 feet provided some advantage, but they were still vulnerable to the rapidly evolving Luftwaffe fighter tactics. The early experience also revealed the psychological demands placed on bomber crews. Missions often lasted 8 to 10 hours, much of it in freezing temperatures, with constant threat from enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Casualty rates were high. Despite this, many crews completed their required 25 missions and returned to the U.S. as heroes. The B-17's growing legend was reinforced by stories of aircraft limping back to base with shredded wings, missing stabilizers, or engines ablaze, testaments to its resilience and engineering. One of the defining moments in the B-17's early combat career came during the August 1943 raid on the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. Although the mission was deemed necessary for disrupting German industry, the formation suffered devastating losses due to lack of adequate fighter escort. Of the 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were lost, and hundreds of crewmen killed or captured. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions exposed the limits of the self-defending bomber concept and prompted urgent efforts to extend fighter range. Despite the losses, the campaign also demonstrated the strategic value of the B-17. Damage assessments showed significant disruption to German production capacity, forcing the enemy to reallocate resources toward homeland defense. The B-17 was proving to be not just a weapon, but a strategic tool, capable of shaping the war on a national scale. As the scale and intensity of operations grew, the B-17 became the backbone of the Allied daylight bombing strategy. It was no longer an experimental concept or a tool of deterrence. It was now a frontline instrument of destruction, flying daily missions into the heart of the Reich and returning more often than not against the odds. By 1944, the B-17 Flying Fortress had fully matured into its role as the primary tool of strategic bombing in the European theater. The 8th Air Force had grown into a formidable force, launching hundreds of B-17s daily from England to strike critical targets throughout Nazi-occupied Europe and Germany itself. With improved coordination, experience, and the introduction of long-range escort fighters such as the P-51 Mustang, the Flying Fortress began to show its full potential in the skies over Europe. The strategic bombing campaign expanded in scope and ambition. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, transportation hubs, and military installations became top priority targets. Operations like Big Week in February 1944 demonstrated a shift in Allied air doctrine, overwhelming, continuous pressure applied by massed formations of heavy bombers to cripple German industrial output and air defenses ahead of the planned invasion of Western Europe. During Big Week alone, over 3,500 B-17s were dispatched, marking one of the largest air offensives in history up to that point. These missions were made possible not only by the B-17's mechanical resilience, but by significant improvements in bombing accuracy and formation flying. Crews used the Norden bomb sight, a complex mechanical device that allowed trained bombardiers to make precise drops from high altitude under clear weather conditions. While not infallible, it improved the ability to hit industrial targets and was central to the U.S. doctrine of daylight precision bombing. As opposed to the British Royal Air Force's nighttime area bombing, the B-17G, the most produced and most refined variant, entered service during this phase. It introduced a new chin turret to defend against head-on fighter attacks, one of the major vulnerabilities identified in previous models. The B-17G carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns with defensive positions covering all angles of approach. It could carry a standard bomb load of 4,000, 5,000 pounds over long distances and even more on shorter range missions. The aircraft's robust airframe meant it could return to base with severe damage that would down many other bombers. Combat adaptation was constant. Crews developed tighter combat box formations that allowed interlocking fields of fire. Tactics evolved to deal with German fighters attacking in coordinated waves, first with frontal assaults, then diving from above or behind. The Luftwaffe's response included heavily armed fighters like the FW-190 and Bf-110, and even the use of aerial ramming and rocket attacks. The B-17, while formidable, still relied heavily on its escorts for survival during the most dangerous segments of deep penetration raids. One of the most iconic missions showcasing the B-17's operational importance came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Flying Fortress units struck coastal defenses, road networks, and rail hubs across Normandy to isolate German forces and disrupt counterattack efforts. That day alone, more than 1,500 B-17s flew in support of the Allied landings, delivering thousands of tons of ordnance that helped pave the way for the invasion force. Throughout the Normandy campaign, B-17s continued to provide strategic depth by hitting targets far beyond the beaches, delaying German reinforcements and eroding their logistical capability. Despite its proven success, the cost remained high. Losses among B-17 crews were significant. While the aircraft could absorb damage and limp home under harrowing conditions, it could not guarantee survival. Early in the campaign, bomber crews had a grim statistical expectation. Many did not survive the required 25 missions before rotation. As the war progressed, improvements in escort coverage and suppression of German air defenses gradually lowered the attrition rate, but the mental and physical toll on airmen remained immense. By late 1944, the B-17 had helped achieve one of its primary goals, gaining air superiority over Western Europe. The destruction of aircraft factories, fuel supplies, and Luftwaffe airfields weakened Germany's ability to contest the skies. With the Luftwaffe in retreat and Allied armies advancing, the B-17 shifted toward broader operational support, hitting retreating forces, supply lines, and strategic cities in preparation for the final push into Germany. In the last months of the war, B-17s took part in controversial missions such as the bombing of Dresden, where questions about military necessity versus civilian impact would follow historians for decades. Regardless of the debates, the role of the B-17 in shaping the air war over Europe was undisputed. It had not only delivered destructive force, but had forced the enemy to divert resources to air defense, shifted the strategic calculus, and helped pave the way for ground offensives that liberated the continent. The Flying Fortress was no longer just a machine, it had become a symbol of persistence, of sacrifice, and of America's industrial and military reach. Its very silhouette came to represent the relentless pressure applied from above, day after day, raid after raid, until the Axis war machine could no longer endure. The evolution of the B-17 Flying Fortress during its wartime service was a continuous process of adaptation and refinement, driven by battlefield experience and technological advancement. From the early YB-17 models to the final B-17G variant, the aircraft underwent numerous changes in structure, armament, avionics, and mission capability, each tailored to extend its survivability and operational effectiveness in the increasingly hostile skies over Europe and the Pacific. The earliest production models, such as the B-17B, C, and D, were stepping stones that identified critical shortcomings. These aircraft had limited defensive armament, lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, and were vulnerable to concentrated enemy fighter attacks. As losses mounted and feedback from combat crews accumulated, Boeing engineers responded quickly. By the time the B-17E emerged in 1941, the aircraft had grown a longer tail to house a new tailgun position, redesigned vertical stabilizers for better stability and improved armor protection. One of the most important additions in the B-17F was the increased fuel capacity and enhanced defensive firepower. However, this model still lacked frontal protection, making it especially vulnerable to head-on fighter attacks, a tactic increasingly favored by experienced Luftwaffe pilots. This led to the development of the B-17G, the most produced and definitive version, with over 8,600 units built. The B-17G featured the now famous Chin turret, equipped with twin 50-caliber machine guns offering critical coverage of the aircraft's forward arc. Across all variants, the number of defensive machine guns increased significantly. While the early models carried 5 or 6, the later versions carried up to 13, placed at strategic positions: nose, chin, top turret, waist positions, ball turret, and tail. Crews of 10 men typically included a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 5 gunners, each responsible for maintaining a specific section of the bomber's perimeter defense. This configuration transformed the B-17 into a heavily armed aerial fortress capable of independent operations, at least in theory. In addition to combat variants, the B-17 platform spawned several specialized versions. The F-9 photographic reconnaissance model replaced the bomb racks with high-resolution cameras and mapping equipment. The CB-17 was used for cargo and personnel transport, while the QB-17 was later modified as a drone controller or even as a target drone itself in post-war testing. There were also radar-equipped versions used for training or electronic warfare experiments. Some B-17s were retrofitted with early radio navigation systems or radar countermeasures, showcasing their adaptability beyond their original bombing mission. Boeing was not the only company involved in producing the B-17. Due to the scale of wartime demand, Lockheed's Vega division and Douglas Aircraft Company were brought in to share the manufacturing burden. This collaborative effort ensured that B-17 production met the rapid pace of Allied strategic planning. At its peak, factories produced dozens of B-17s per day, with assembly lines optimized for rapid throughput and component standardization. The aircraft's relatively modular construction allowed for easier field repairs and upgrades, ensuring long-term serviceability. International use of the B-17 was limited but notable. The Royal Air Force operated a number of B-17s under the designation Fortress Yerbassin II and III. While the RAF initially struggled to incorporate the bomber into their nighttime bombing strategy, the aircraft later found success in coastal command, maritime patrol, and electronic warfare roles. The Free French and Brazilian Air Forces also used small numbers of B-17s for transport and training purposes during and after the war. The technological legacy of the B-17 extended far beyond its service life. It demonstrated the importance of integrating offensive and defensive systems within a single airframe. Its structural durability, thanks in part to its semi-monocoque fuselage design, set new standards in survivability. Its high-altitude capabilities and long-range performance laid the foundation for future generations of heavy bombers, including the B-29 Superfortress, which would bring the war to a close in the Pacific. Moreover, the operational data collected from B-17 missions contributed directly to post-war developments in radar, electronic warfare, pressurized cabins, and formation tactics. The aircraft's long operational history, spanning thousands of missions and millions of flight hours, provided invaluable lessons in engineering, logistics, and combat doctrine. As the war progressed and the Axis powers were driven into retreat, the B-17 began to transition from being a frontline bomber to a symbol of strategic success. Even as newer aircraft emerged, none could replace the reputation and psychological presence the Flying Fortress had earned through sheer endurance and performance. It had proven not only effective in combat but also adaptable across a wide spectrum of missions, cementing its status as one of the most iconic aircraft in military aviation history. As the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, the operational role of the B-17 Flying Fortress began to diminish. But its legacy was only beginning to take shape. With the collapse of Nazi Germany, strategic bombing operations over Europe were suspended, and many B-17s were retired from combat service, reassigned, or scrapped. Yet the aircraft remained active in several capacities, both during the final campaigns in the Pacific and in the immediate post-war period, where it found a variety of new uses that extended its relevance far beyond its original purpose. While the B-29 Superfortress took over the primary heavy bombing role against Japan, B-17 still contributed in secondary roles across the Pacific. They were employed for maritime patrol, search and rescue missions, reconnaissance, and even as weather observation platforms. The long range and rugged construction of the B-17 made it well suited for extended flights over open ocean or remote areas. In particular, B-17s equipped with radar and camera gear were invaluable for mapping operations and pre-invasion reconnaissance. Following Japan's surrender in August 1945, thousands of B-17s were flown back to the United States. Some were sold off as surplus, others scrapped, and a number converted for peacetime uses. The post-war U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the U.S. Air Force in 1947, retained a few B-17s for training, utility, and experimental purposes. Modified versions were used to test new equipment, weapon systems, and electronic warfare countermeasures during the early years of the Cold War. Their large internal volume and flight stability made them ideal for such experimental roles. One of the most notable post-war uses was in the development of guided missile systems. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, some B-17s were converted into remote-controlled drones, QB-17, and motherships, DB-17, to test air-to-air missile systems. These unmanned aircraft were flown into target zones to evaluate the effectiveness of emerging guided weapons. Ironically, the bomber that once symbolized manned aerial dominance was now helping usher in the age of precision-guided munitions and unmanned flight. Outside of military service, a number of B-17s found second lives in civilian hands. Some were sold to private operators for use as cargo aircraft, firebombers, or aerial survey platforms. Others were acquired by museums and preservation groups, beginning a long process of restoring surviving airframes for display or flight. By the 1950s and 1960s, the B-17 had become a central fixture in aviation museums across the United States, Europe, and Latin America, where its role in the Allied victory was increasingly recognized by new generations. The cultural impact of the B-17 also solidified during the post-war era. Hollywood films, memoirs, and documentaries elevated its image in public consciousness. Movies such as 12 O'Clock High, 1949, and Memphis Belle, 1990, dramatized the experiences of bomber crews and contributed to the mythology surrounding the aircraft. It became an enduring symbol of sacrifice, teamwork, and the industrial might of the United States during World War II. Technically, the B-17 left a profound mark on aviation design and doctrine. It validated the importance of redundancy, crew survivability, and long-range operational planning. Its combat history demonstrated the limitations of unescorted bombing and directly influenced the development of post-war doctrines emphasizing combined arms and integrated fighter-bomber operations. Lessons learned from B-17 campaigns contributed to the U.S. Air Force's eventual shift toward jet-powered strategic bombers, most notably the B-47 and B-52. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy, kept flying by dedicated restoration groups and aviation heritage organizations. Many more are preserved in static displays, often meticulously restored with original markings and interiors. These aircraft serve as educational tools and reminders of the war's human and technological dimensions. Each rivet, gun station, and weathered panel tells a story of endurance and innovation under fire. The B-17 Flying Fortress, designed in the interwar years for a future war no one could fully envision, ultimately helped define the outcome of that conflict. From the skies over Europe and the Pacific to radar tests over Nevada and aerial firefighting in California, its versatility, durability, and historical significance remain unmatched among its contemporaries. More than just a bomber, the B-17 was a testament to what industrial ingenuity, strategic foresight, and human resolve could accomplish when aligned with purpose. Beyond its celebrated combat history and post-war service, the B-17 Flying Fortress has a lesser-known chapter filled with specialized roles, forgotten missions, and experimental applications that extended far beyond the battlefield. These hidden aspects reveal the aircraft's remarkable adaptability and its contribution to military aviation long after its primary function had faded. While many bombers were retired or scrapped, the B-17 was frequently repurposed for roles that helped define new eras of aerospace technology, scientific research, and Cold War innovation. One significant but often overlooked use of the B-17 was in atmospheric and weather research. During the late 1940s and into the 1950s, surplus B-17s were retrofitted with meteorological instruments and flown into tropical storms and hurricanes for data collection. These early hurricane hunter missions provided invaluable information about storm structure and behavior, laying the foundation for the U.S. Air Force and NOAA's later dedicated weather reconnaissance programs. The aircraft's high-altitude ceiling, endurance, and stable flight characteristics made it ideal for these hazardous missions, often flying directly into the eye of developing cyclones. The B-17 also played a unique role in high-altitude nuclear testing programs. In operations such as Crossroads and later tests in the Pacific Proving Grounds, B-17s were used as drone platforms to fly through radioactive clouds following nuclear detonations. These unmanned aircraft, remotely guided from accompanying DB-17 control ships, collected air samples and radiation data, helping scientists understand fallout patterns and thermal effects. This work contributed directly to Cold War nuclear strategy and the development of protective measures for future crews and aircraft operating in contaminated environments. In the realm of signals intelligence and electronic warfare, several B-17s were modified with specialized antennas and classified electronic suites. These aircraft, often under civilian or covert military markings, were used for early forms of electronic surveillance during reconnaissance missions near or over hostile territory. While the details of many of these operations remain classified, declassified fragments suggest B-17s conducted ELINT, electronic intelligence missions over Eastern Europe, Korea, and even the Soviet periphery during the 1950s. These missions were hazardous and highly secretive, with aircraft often shadowed by interceptors or forced to evade detection entirely. Another fascinating chapter in the B-17's post-war life was its involvement in the development of air defense interception tactics. During the dawn of the jet age, B-17s served as targets and simulators for testing radar-guided missiles and interceptor aircraft. In these exercises, drone-configured B-17s would fly predetermined routes, while Air Force fighters attempted to track and engage them using radar and early guided weaponry. These operations were instrumental in refining the combat effectiveness of missiles like the AIM-4 Falcon and the procedures of NORAD's aerial defense grid. A smaller number of B-17s found employment in civilian scientific research. Organizations such as NASA and various universities used the aircraft as flying laboratories. They conducted experiments in aerodynamics, atmospheric composition, and even cosmic ray detection. In one case, a B-17 was used to test prototype equipment for high-altitude flight suits and pressurization systems that would later be used in spaceflight programs. The platform's ample internal space and adaptability made it a cost-effective solution for complex technical trials. Not all lesser-known missions were successful. Efforts to convert the B-17 into a jet-powered testbed or a heavy cargo hauler ultimately failed due to structural limitations and economic inefficiency. Similarly, attempts to develop a B-17 successor based on the same principles, a heavily armed self-defending bomber, were made obsolete by new doctrines emphasizing speed, stealth, and precision over armor and gunfire. Yet even these failures offered valuable lessons that influenced the design of future aircraft and strategic planning. Finally, the testimonies of test pilots, technicians, and researchers who worked with post-war B-17s paint a picture of deep respect for the aircraft. Many recalled its forgiving handling, resilience in flight, and ability to absorb modification without losing reliability. In a time of rapid technological change, the Flying Fortress remained a trusted and familiar workhorse, one that bridged generations of aviation innovation. The unseen chapters of the B-17's life reflect a broader truth about military aviation, that the impact of a great aircraft extends far beyond its time in combat. From flying into nuclear clouds and hurricanes to launching the missile age and supporting scientific frontiers, the B-17 proved its worth in roles that few could have envisioned during its original design phase. It became not just a bomber, but a platform for progress, curiosity, and the evolving needs of a changing world. As the decades passed, the B-17 Flying Fortress transitioned from an instrument of war to a revered historical artifact, but the process of its preservation and remembrance was neither swift nor guaranteed. In the immediate post-war years, the surplus of military aircraft was seen more as a logistical burden than a cultural treasure. Thousands of B-17s were dismantled, melted down, or left to corrode in aircraft boneyards across the American Southwest. At the time, there was little public demand to preserve aging warplanes, especially ones associated with destruction and conflict. Yet a small group of veterans, historians, and aviation enthusiasts recognized the significance of the B-17 and began efforts to preserve what remained. In the 1950s and 1960s, these individuals began acquiring derelict airframes from scrapyards or repurposed civilian operators. Some were found in remote locations, former aerial survey platforms in Alaska, abandoned weather aircraft in Latin America, or forgotten drones in the desert. Restoration was a painstaking process. Parts were scarce, technical manuals often incomplete, and skilled labor difficult to find. But the determination of these groups laid the foundation for one of the most enduring aircraft preservation movements in history. As Cold War anxieties gave way to broader historical reflection in the 1970s and 1980s, interest in the B-17 surged. Public sentiment shifted toward honoring the sacrifices of the greatest generation, and the Flying Fortress became a centerpiece of this cultural reevaluation. Museums across the United States began showcasing restored B-17s, often placing them alongside dioramas, mission logs, and personal artifacts from wartime crews. For many veterans, seeing these aircraft again, fully restored with original markings, was an emotional experience, a tangible link to their most formative and perilous years. Flight-capable restorations were even more rare and labor-intensive. Rebuilding a B-17 to airworthy condition required sourcing original parts or fabricating replacements to precise specifications. The complexity of the aircraft, combined with modern aviation safety regulations, meant that only a handful could be maintained in flying condition. Those that took to the skies again were often operated by non-profit foundations and featured in air shows, documentaries, and public education programs. Aircraft like Sentimental Journey, Aluminum Overcast, and Texas Raiders became flying ambassadors of history, connecting new generations to the lived experience of aerial warfare. Internationally, several B-17s were preserved as well. The United Kingdom, for example, maintains a few surviving airframes that were used by the RAF or transferred during the war. Others are displayed in museums across Europe, especially in countries once occupied by the Axis, where Allied bombing played a significant role in the liberation or devastation of local infrastructure. These exhibits often balance the aircraft's military role with the human cost of aerial warfare, presenting a nuanced view of the bomber's legacy. The cultural representation of the B-17 also grew in parallel. Beyond film, literature, and television further entrenched its image in popular memory. Memoirs by bomber crews, many published decades after the war, offered first-hand insights into the realities of flying combat missions. The tension, monotony, fear, and camaraderie of high-altitude bombing runs were vividly conveyed, often contrasting the heroism of the aircraft's public image with the psychological toll it exacted on those aboard. As the number of surviving airworthy B-17s dwindled, the aircraft's symbolic value increased. Each surviving plane became not just a historical object but a relic of national memory. Flyovers at commemorative events, D-Day anniversaries, or veterans' funerals became powerful acts of remembrance, linking past and present through the roar of radial engines and the unmistakable silhouette of the fortress overhead. However, the preservation efforts were not without setbacks. Accidents and structural fatigue claimed several restored B-17s over the decades. The most tragic incident occurred in October 2019 when the B-17-909 crashed in Connecticut, killing 7 people. The event reignited debates about the safety of operating historic aircraft and raised difficult questions about balancing public education with preservation and risk. Still, the efforts to remember and honor the B-17 have persisted. Digital archives, 3D scans, oral history projects, and virtual museum exhibits now complement the physical restoration efforts, ensuring that even as the aircraft itself fades from active flight, its story remains accessible to future generations. The B-17 has become a vessel not just of bombs and bullets, but of memory and meaning. Its journey, from prototype to wartime workhorse, from nuclear drone to museum piece, is unparalleled in the history of aviation, and in every hangar where it rests, in every air show where it still flies, and in every book where its name is mentioned, the Flying Fortress continues to fulfill its mission, to carry the weight of history, one rivet and one story at a time. While the B-17 Flying Fortress is most widely remembered for its role in Europe, its footprint extended far beyond the Western Front. Forgotten missions, peripheral theaters, and classified deployments formed a shadow history of the aircraft, one that rarely features in official accounts, but was nonetheless critical to the broader objectives of Allied strategy. These lesser-known operations, often isolated or experimental in nature, pushed the boundaries of what the aircraft could do and where it could go. In the early stages of the Pacific War, B-17s were among the first American heavy bombers to respond to Japanese advances. Before the arrival of B-24s and B-29s, B-17 units based in Australia and the Dutch East Indies carried out long-range bombing missions against Japanese shipping lanes, airfields, and troop concentrations. These operations were logistically complex and fraught with danger. Missions routinely exceeded 10 hours, often with minimal navigational support and no fighter escort. In one notable operation during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, B-17s played a supporting role in disrupting a Japanese troop convoy, contributing to a major Allied air-sea victory. The aircraft was also used in the China-Burma-India theater, where Allied air power faced difficult terrain, unreliable weather, and immense logistical challenges. B-17s flew from bases in India to strike targets across Burma and into Japanese-occupied China. These flights tested the limits of the aircraft's range and durability, often operating from primitive runways with little support infrastructure. In this theater, the B-17 was also used for long-distance reconnaissance and supply drops, underscoring its versatility under extreme conditions. In the Mediterranean and North Africa, B-17s took part in campaigns often overshadowed by events in Northern Europe. Beginning in late 1942, B-17s flew from bases in Algeria and Tunisia against targets in Sicily, Italy, and southern France. These raids paved the way for the Allied invasion of Italy and played a significant role in isolating Axis positions across the Mediterranean. The missions were intense, with enemy fighters and flak proving just as lethal as over the Reich, but often under harsher climate conditions and more difficult terrain. Another overlooked role of the B-17 involved anti-submarine warfare. Before the widespread deployment of long-range patrol aircraft like the consolidated PB-4Y2 privateer, modified B-17s, designated as B-17E ASW, were used to patrol the Atlantic coastline and the Caribbean, searching for German U-boats. Equipped with radar and depth charges, these aircraft conducted maritime patrols from bases in the continental U.S., Iceland, the Azores, and the West Indies. In several documented cases, B-17s successfully spotted and attacked enemy submarines, contributing directly to the safety of Allied convoys crossing the Atlantic. Post-war, some of these lesser-known missions continued in modified form. During the Berlin airlift in 1948-49, several demilitarized B-17s were used for non-combat support operations, ferrying supplies or personnel between airbases in Western Europe. Others were quietly transferred to Allied air forces during the early stages of Cold War realignment. Countries like Portugal, Brazil, and even post-war France received small numbers of B-17s, often for maritime patrol or training purposes, though few remained operational for long. In Latin America, particularly in Colombia and Mexico, B-17s were used for everything from mail delivery to mapping unexplored regions. Though no longer bristling with guns, the aircraft retained its long-range endurance and payload capacity, making it a practical, if aging, platform in regions with limited aviation infrastructure. These post-war civilian missions helped extend the operational life of the B-17 well into the 1950s, often in remote areas far from the spotlight of military history. A few units were even used in covert intelligence roles during the early Cold War. While documentation remains scarce, declassified fragments suggest that B-17s were occasionally flown near Soviet borders under civilian covers, collecting electronic intelligence or conducting aerial photography. These missions, highly sensitive and often unauthorized, carried significant political risk, but they demonstrated the continued relevance of the B-17 as a flexible, long-range platform, even as jet technology began to dominate the skies. Each of these forgotten uses and peripheral missions adds depth to the B-17 story. They show a machine that was not only central to a global conflict, but capable of adapting to roles and geographies that were never envisioned in its original blueprint. From anti-submarine patrols off Greenland to secretive reconnaissance near the Baltic Sea, the B-17's reach was global, its versatility unmatched among its contemporaries. The legacy of these forgotten missions is not just technical, it is human. The crews who flew them often did so without fanfare, recognition, or the support infrastructure available to larger theaters. Their contributions, scattered across obscure outposts and remote skies, formed a patchwork of quiet endurance. Together, they affirm what the B-17 ultimately became. Not just a bomber, but a global workhorse of the 20th century, flying wherever it was needed, however it was asked. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is one of technological ingenuity, strategic necessity, and enduring legacy. Designed in the interwar period to meet theoretical requirements, it became one of the most important aircraft of the Second World War, serving as the spearhead of the Allied daylight bombing campaign and symbolizing American industrial and aerial power. But beyond its combat record and engineering evolution, the B-17 became something rarer, a unifying emblem of an era defined by total war, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of strategic dominance from the skies. As a bomber, B-17 redefined what was possible in aerial warfare. Its combination of range, payload, and defensive armament allowed it to reach deep into enemy territory without the need for constant escort, at least in theory. While operational realities would later demand long-range fighter support, the concept of the self-defending bomber shaped years of doctrine and thousands of missions. Crews flew into heavily contested airspace day after day at altitudes above 25,000 feet in unpressurized, frigid conditions. They endured flak, fighter attacks, mechanical failures, and the psychological toll of seeing comrades lost in mid-air firestorms. The Flying Fortress became their shield, their weapon, and often their final companion. Its role in the European theater was transformative. The strategic bombing campaign spearheaded by formations of B-17s devastated German industry, transportation, and oil production. While the effectiveness of individual raids varied and ethical questions remain about the human cost in civilian areas, the cumulative effect of sustained bombing over years was undeniable. Germany was forced to divert massive resources to home defense, weakening its capacity to fight on other fronts. In this way, the B-17 contributed directly to shortening the war and to shaping the post-war balance of power. But its importance extended well beyond combat. The aircraft became a platform for experimentation and innovation. It helped pioneer high-altitude navigation, long-range formation tactics, remote-controlled drones, nuclear sampling, and even early electronic warfare. It trained generations of pilots, bombardiers, navigators, and gunners in the art and science of modern aerial operations. Its design principles, modularity, redundancy, crew survivability, echoed in later aircraft like the B-29, B-52, and even the jet-powered strategic bombers of the Cold War. The B-17 was also deeply embedded in public consciousness. It appeared in newsreels, propaganda films, and recruitment posters. Its name, Flying Fortress, carried weight and meaning. It spoke to invulnerability, to strength in numbers, to the idea that precision and perseverance could win wars from the air. Veterans who flew it remembered it not just as a machine, but as a character, unforgiving at times, but dependable when it mattered most. Its fuselage bore the scars of missions survived. Its nose art reflected the humor and fears of the crews, and its roar signaled both resolve and reckoning. In peacetime, the aircraft underwent a kind of second life. It served as a scientific instrument, a Cold War relic, a flying classroom, and finally as a historical monument. Fewer than 50 complete airframes survive today, and only a handful remain airworthy. Yet they continue to fly at air shows, their engines rumbling across skies once again, carrying no bombs now, only memory. On the ground, static displays in museums around the world preserve not just the airframe, but the human story embedded in every panel and rivet. Today, the B-17 stands as one of the most iconic military aircraft in history. Its silhouette evokes a specific time when air power was redefining warfare, when mass production met mass mobilization, and when the outcome of a global conflict depended in part on the courage of 10 men inside an aluminum shell. It is remembered not just for its design or its missions, but for what it represents: endurance, sacrifice, and the calculated reach of a nation determined to bring war to the heart of its enemy. The legacy of the B-17 is etched into the skies it once crossed, the history books it helped write, and the generations it inspired. It remains a monument in motion, its final mission not one of destruction, but of remembrance, education, and honor.